Astronomy in Reverse by Plansley. Chapter 15. For a moment. The room almost immediately feels colder. Tony and Steve share a tense glance, but the only thing Bucky is focused on is the way Peter has gone still as a statue. The boy looks up at him sharply when Bucky approaches, laying his hand on his rigid shoulder, and Bucky is struck by the wideness of his eyes and the undeniable fear he finds there. Clearing his throat, Tony slips his mask of flippancy back into place and pulls out his phone.
"Put it there to myself, right?"
he says, pressing the device to his ear as he leaves the room. Steve turns and gives Bucky a reassuring nod, sending a quick smile Peter's way before he turns and follows the other man.
"It's gonna be all right, Pete,"
Bucky says comfortingly, patting his back. He knows that Tony's AI is always listening and that he should be careful of what he says, but right now, soothing the stifling amount of anxiety pouring off of his kid is more important to him than making sure Tony and Steve think his cooperation is unwavering.
"No matter what he says, I won't let them separate us, even if it means going on the run again."
Peter gives a small nod, his hands folded in his lap, his shoulders hunched. He looks so small like this. He always looks small, especially compared to Bucky, but when he's afraid and he curls in on himself, condensing into almost half his usual size, Bucky feels nearly sick from how strong the urge to comfort and protect him becomes. It's dizzying, the instinct that wells up in him in moments like these. It's a surge of anxiety unlike anything Bucky's ever known. He lets his hand move from the boy's shoulder to the top of his head, where he gently musses his hair, careful not to let any of Peter's unruly curls catch in the joints of his metal hand. Peter relaxes slightly, the barest hint of tension leaving his body as he lets his head slump against the side of Bucky's leg. Bucky continues running his fingers through his hair, soothing him, his gaze drifting up to the window beside them, overlooking the lake still visible in the fading light of twilight. The sun has gone down, but it's not dark yet, and it's thanks to that Bucky can easily see the shapes moving in the water rippling, the waves rolling up to the dock, and Tony's manicured lawn. Bucky stares for a moment, his hand stilled, before he reaches down to Peter's shoulder, nudging him.
"Pete,"
he says quiet, as if they could hear him.
"Pete, look."
Peter looks up at him first, confused, before he follows Bucky's nod to turn his gaze out the window. He has to stand to see what Bucky is pointing at, and Bucky gently takes his shoulder into his hands so he doesn't move too fast and startle them, moving both of them slowly toward the window so they can stand and watch. "Wow!" Peter says, breathless, his muscles relaxing beneath Bucky's hands, his fear and tension entirely forgotten. They can only see the heads and shoulders above the water, the tall curved antlers on the bulls reaching high above its surface. "Those deer look really weird."
"Those are elk,"
Bucky gently says. They watch the herd move forward in the water, finally reaching their side of the lake. Each one of them shakes their pelts dry as they step onto the land, curiously sniffing the grass and landscaped garden of Stark's immaculate backyard. Bucky almost laughs as the doe reaches up and takes a bite out of one of the man's shrubs, misshapen it. "They're so big!" says Peter, quietly creeping forward so he can take a seat on the wide window ledge. "I didn't know elk could swim."
"I don't think Stark did either, otherwise he probably would have fenced off the lake,"
Bucky jokes.
"And if you think those guys are big, wait till you see a moose. An average bull would be about 3 feet taller than her,"
he says as he points to the doe happily destroying Stark's garden. "Should we stop them?"
"Nah, they're hungry from swimming across the lake. Let them eat."
The herd continues to graze on Stark's lawn, well after it's gone dark and the porch lights have automatically switched on to brighten the backyard. Bucky and Peter don't say a word, content to merely sit and observe the wildlife, the peacefulness of it, how not a single one of them makes a sound. That is, of course, until Tony and Steve return, flicking on the lights as soon as they emerge from the hallway.
"What are you guys doing sitting in the dark?"
Tony gripes, and the volume of his voice, mixed with the sight of him stampeding in front of the window and the sudden light pouring into the backyard, startles the herd, sending them scattering away from the porch and the building and into the brush before Tony and Steve can even see them. It's almost too fitting for Bucky to even be annoyed at it. A peaceful moment between him and Peter, thoroughly disrupted by Steve and Stark, without a second thought.
"We were admiring the garden."
Bucky drawls before Peter can come clean that they just sat and watched it get half-eaten.
What did T'Challa have to say?
Steve and Tony glance at each other, the briefest flicker of their gazes, but beside him, Peter has tensed up again into solid rock.
We didn't get much information,
says Steve regretfully, grimacing slightly at Peter's deer-in-the-headlights expression.
He just wanted us to know he was on his way. He'll be here first thing in the morning.
Bucky keeps his expression neutral and forthcoming. He knows how, and a small part of him is grateful for that, despite the things that led to it.
Did he say why?
Tony glances at Steve, but the man keeps his and Bucky's gazes locked, his face grim, set in that familiar tight expression Bucky can remember him wearing it every day back in Germany. A captain's face. Steve's always had it since the days he was so small he made Peter look like a giant.
No,
he says, but the thing he truly wants to say rings clear in his tone. They can all guess why T'Challa would come, why he would refuse to tell them.
He just said he'll see us tomorrow. He's a hard guy to read,
Tony adds, stuffing his hands into his pockets.
Couldn't quite pick up on his tone, but he didn't sound murderously angry, which is a good sign.
His eyes sweep the three of them, acknowledging that his joke failed to lighten the mood, and adds,
There's no use standing here all night trying to speculate what he's up to. For all we know, he could be coming by to talk about the Accords or about taking his dad's UN seat. It could have nothing to do with you. And if it does?
Bucky asks, and before he can stop himself, he follows with,
If he comes back here convinced I'm responsible for the bombing, for killing his father, then what?
You aren't responsible! Steve replies firmly, opening his mouth to continue, but Tony cuts him off, interrupting him.
If whoever framed you did a good enough job to convince T'Challa beyond all doubt, then it might be time we take this investigation into our own hands.
He says with a shrug, his tone light, but the look in his eyes when he gazes at Bucky is entirely sympathetic, with perhaps more compassion than he's ever shown Bucky before.
And while you wait for us to complete that investigation, your accommodations might get downgraded somewhat.
Before Bucky, or Steve for that matter, can even open his mouth to respond to that, Peter bolts to his feet so quickly the curtains framing the window behind him flutter and sway. He stands in front of Bucky, staring up at Tony and Steve, his hands balled into fists, his eyes blazing.
You can't let him do that!
He says, and Bucky can hear the driving need in his voice, but his tone is unwavering, the fear swallowed up by all that desperate determination.
It wasn't him! You can't let him believe it is! You can't let him take him away!
Peter, Bucky says, cupping the boy's head and pulling him back, an attempt to settle him down.
Hey kid, take a deep breath, it's all right. No one is taking me anywhere.
Steve and Tony don't look convinced, their faces twisted like they want to disagree with Bucky. He sends them a warning look, and while Tony miraculously holds his tongue, Steve pipes up and said,
Tony is right. There's no use in staying up all night debating it. We'll just have to wait and see what T'Challa says.
He looks down at Peter, but his face doesn't change. He doesn't bother trying to be comforting or make an attempt to placate him. It's a familiar look, that face. It's the face Steve makes when he wants someone to know he's serious.
Regardless of what happens tomorrow, we'll do everything we can to keep you two together. So please don't do anything stupid,
Tony says to Bucky, earning a listless look from Steve.
We're on your side here, so let us handle it. I swear to God, if you make me fly over this dense-ass Montana forest looking for you, you'll be sleeping in the tool shed. Then I guess we'd better get a good night's sleep while we can,
Bucky says, letting the barest hint of a smirk cross his face when Tony looks at him sharply, letting him believe he's only joking.
Come on, Pete.
Peter's body is like granite under his hand, so rigid that Bucky isn't sure how he's even moving it. The kid lets himself be led out of the room, through the long winding hallway, until they reach their bedrooms. To his surprise, the pristinely painted white ceiling of his bedroom isn't any more interesting after the 4th hour of being stared at. Restless, Bucky turns onto his side away from the window, streaming moonlight into his room. All it does is illuminate that empty sofa, shining a spotlight on the fact that this is their new normal now. He knew Peter wouldn't end up sleeping on his couch forever. He did. And yet it's weird to fall asleep without the sound of his sleeping bag rustling every 2 minutes. Depending on how tomorrow goes, he might never hear that sound again. Bucky sighs, pressing the full weight of his head and shoulders into his obnoxiously fluffy pillow, attempting to flatten it into a height that doesn't give him neck trauma. How does Stark sleep like this? He thinks, irritated that he can literally feel what a waste of money these 80,000 thread count sheets are. He probably could have fed himself and Peter for an entire month with the money Tony spent on this damn bedding. He might have to fight Steve again tomorrow if worst comes to worst. Despite what the man had said, part of him doubts he could turn on Tony and the entire kingdom of Wakanda just for him. They've spent almost a century not even knowing each other, much less actually being friends. Not to mention the fact that Bucky has a hard enough time remembering the friendship they used to have without passing out in his arms like a basket case. Steve is loyal, he's proved that. But there's no way he would risk his new life in this millennium for a ghost from a lifetime ago. And yet, frustratingly, the idea won't leave him. Somehow, it's almost comforting to think of Steve coming with them, even though he'd never ask him to do such a thing. The thought of the three of them on the run together, traveling the world until they found a small secluded spot where they could build a peaceful life. It's soothing, almost. They could find a spot just like this on the water somewhere. He could build them a home, maybe not as nice as this mansion, but sturdy and big enough for the three of them. Steve could help him paint it. Peter could help him lay the roof. It would be a camping trip they'd never have to come home from. They could live off the land, spending summer and fall storing food and firewood for the winter. They could fish and hunt and grow their own vegetables. Maybe they could find a stray dog in need of a home somewhere for Peter. It would be serene, a life without fighting, something he didn't used to dare think he could have. Bucky closes his eyes, a small smile on his face. It won't happen. Peter would miss the city. He would feel too cooped up in a vast wilderness like this one for too long, without people, without mental stimulation. And he doubts the idea of a life like that would appeal to Steve now either, not after these last few years of being a muttered man. But the thought is nice. His eyes snap open at the faint sound of footsteps outside his door, followed by 3 shy, hesitant knocks. Dad? He barely has a chance to sit upright before the doorknob is turning, Peter poking his head in through the crack. Pete? Bucky says, watching Peter slip into the room and silently close the door behind him. What's wrong? Peter lingers near the door for a moment, fidgeting, not meeting his eyes. Even in the dark, Bucky can see that he's tired, that he spent the last few hours tossing and turning just like he has. He looks a little embarrassed to be standing here, like he feels out of place. But more than anything, he looks terrified. It's not exactly a mystery as to why. After all, Bucky hasn't been able to fall asleep either. Couldn't sleep, huh? He says, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and then patting the spot next to him, gesturing for the boy to sit. Want to talk about it? Could I? Peter starts quietly, toying with the loose sleeve of his oversized sweater. Could I stay here for the night? Bucky's about to open his mouth to question it, but Peter glances longingly at the untouched sofa across from the bed, seeming utterly lost. Bucky understands then what it is he's really asking for. Sure thing, kiddo. Turning, he piles the heavy duvet and one of the gigantic pillows into his arms, grateful for once that rich people sleep with enough bedding for 12 people, before carrying them to the couch. Here, lay down. He hands Peter the pillow and blanket and lets him get comfortable, then steps back and climbs onto his own bed, watching with slight amusement as Peter stretches his legs and back, making himself as long as possible, and finding he still has room before his feet touch the armrest. It surprises him seeing Peter lying there across from his bed, like he has every morning for the last year. Part of him thought the kid would be excited, maybe even relieved, to finally have his own room, his own space. But he supposes after everything he's been through, maybe it's not the weirdest or worst thing, Peter not wanting to be alone. Especially not tonight, when it feels like tomorrow could be the end of the world. If this is the last night he gets to have with his kids, then screw it, he'll give Peter every shred of comfort he can muster. I thought it would be quieter. Bucky says, pulled from his thoughts, looking over and noticing Peter has wrapped himself around his pillow, hugging it and resting his head on it. You thought what would be quieter? The forest. Peter's voice is slow and quiet, as if deep in thought. Compared to Queen's, I thought it would be silent, but it's deafening. Bucky holds still, straining his ears as if he could hear what Peter is talking about, like there's something he's been missing since they came here. But he hears nothing, just the gentle rustle of Peter fidgeting with the edge of his blanket, his quiet, anxious breaths.
I'm used to a lot of noise, you know. I mean, they call it the city that never sleeps. I'm used to cars honking and people talking and laughing and shouting and people driving by super fast late at night with their music blaring. And at home, all our neighbors were so loud all the time.
A smile crosses Bucky's face, remembering the last time he and Peter had stayed up late like this, talking across the room after their upstairs neighbors decided 2 a.m. was the perfect time for an impromptu guitar and drum session.
But this place,
Peter continues, turning over onto his back, staring up at the ceiling,
is never quiet either, and all the sounds are so creepy, like those birds that keep howling at the moon, and all the coyotes and foxes screaming.
He turns back and fixes Bucky with a hard look, something anxious and desperate crossing his face.
And the wind! It keeps rattling my window and making all the trees creak and knock against each other. That whole forest is like an ocean, except it's worse because it's full of bears.
Bucky almost feels to stop himself from laughing. Almost.
That's definitely a big change from Queens.
Peter sighs, burying half his face into the plush cushion, sinking into it.
Yeah,
he says, his voice small.
But at least you're here.
He wants to close his eyes, let sleep pull him from this long day that he's had, but he can't seem to bear letting Peter out of his sight in that moment. It might be the last time. In the morning, this could end, getting to fall asleep watching his son lying there safe and sound. It might be the last time he ever gets to have this moment of peace, if T'Challa is coming here for justice tomorrow. It might be the last time he ever sees his son fall asleep. So he keeps his eyes open, waiting, because if it's the last time, he's going to burn it so deeply into his memory that not even Hydra could take it from him.
Dad,
Peter says barely above a whisper,
promise you won't let them take you away.
He lets his eyes close. It's the hardest thing, knowing what your child needs you to say, but not knowing if it's the right thing to say it. He knows what his loss would mean to Peter. If T'Challa comes for his head tomorrow, he'll fight, even if it means fighting Steve and Tony too. But he doesn't know if that's a fight he can win, and he never wants to lie to Peter again, not after Hydra. But the way Peter is looking at him when he opens his eyes, staring at him across the room, begging him to say what he needs to hear, is too much. It will be the end of me, Bucky thinks, lost in the desperate, hopeless well of Peter's gaze, not being able to say no to those eyes.
I won't let them take me away,
he says, whispering it back, knowing Peter can hear him.
We'll be out of this barren-fisted forest before you know it, Pete. And even if we can't go back to Queens, we'll find some cozy small town to hunker down in with a nice busy street outside your bedroom window so you can get some sleep.
Peter smiles at him, a thread of brightness in the dark.
Okay,
he says, curling up against his pillow, the light pouring in from the window, illuminating the way he closes his eyes sleepily, still smiling.
Sounds good.
Bucky watches, burning it into his memory just like he'd vowed. It's all he can do to stop himself from spiraling. Peter needs him, and a week ago, Bucky wouldn't have hesitated one bit to fight Steve Rogers if it meant keeping his kids safe. His fragmented, century-old memories of a man he doesn't know anymore don't mean anything to him compared to his kid. So why is his heart pounding at the thought? He sits up, letting his legs rest over the edge of the bed, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging. It's that goddamn bruise, the one he gave Steve in the gym when he had that incident. That's what this is, this anxiety, this guilt. Even though the damn thing had nearly faded by dinner, it won't leave his mind, that perfect outline of his metal hand printed on Steve's skin. How many times has he had the exact same nightmare of leaving an identical bruise around Peter's neck? It's not just that he doesn't want to hurt Steve. He doesn't want to hurt anyone. He's never wanted to. There's just something about knowing what kind of violence he's clearly still capable of that has his head spinning. He would fight for Peter, but he's so goddamn tired of it. He stands and walks silently forward, not too concerned about accidentally waking Peter up. The kid slept through much more than this, he knows. It's why he allows himself to gently smooth down the wayward curls sticking out every which way on top of the boy's head, why he doesn't fret about pulling the blanket up higher to cover his kid's exposed neck and shoulders. He would fight for Peter. He would die for Peter if that's what was best for him. But could he kill for him? As quietly as he can, he turns and leaves the room, watching Peter's face to ensure he stays asleep as he silently shuts the door. He just needs to move around, let out the anxiety somehow. If only they were still in Queens, Bucky sighs, missing the way he could jog through the park on nights like this, burning all his excess energy and never having to feel trapped in one room for long. Maybe he should try the gym, see if he can burn it off that way. It seems like a good idea, but the minute he starts heading for the staircase, he thinks of those blue mats covering the floor in the center of the room, and suddenly his stomach feels heavy. Maybe not such a good idea then, if his nerves are still shot about what happened earlier. He sighs again, changing course and heading for the kitchen, thinking maybe a warm drink will help instead. To his surprise, he can see a faint light at the end of the hall, and when he steps out into the room, he's surprised to see Steve there at the island counter, sitting with his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Steve looks up when he enters the room, surprised, his face changing from the hard, pensive expression it held moments ago. "Buck!"
Hi.
he says, stepping into the kitchen and glancing at the kettle on the counter.
There any hot water left?
Yeah, Steve says, clearing his throat a little, before gesturing to the walk-in pantry beside the fridge. There's tea in there on the left, top shelf.
Thanks.
He pours himself a cup of tea, letting the bag steep for a couple minutes before he joins Steve at the island, taking the stool beside him. They sit comfortably for a couple minutes, enjoying their drinks, the room seeming almost black around them, with only the single light dimly shining above their heads. Couldn't sleep, huh? Steve says after a few minutes, taking another sip. You worried about tomorrow?
No point to being worried,
he replies, wondering if Steve can see through him. Probably.
Just trying to plan for what comes next.
Steve is quiet for a moment then.
Can I ask where you would have gone?
His tone so light, Bucky can almost hear the caution in it.
If we hadn't found you first?
Bucky looks at him, seeing for the first time an expression he doesn't recognize on Steve's face. It's alarming being looked at like that when he doesn't know what it means. It takes him a moment to answer, and Steve takes it as a snub, continuing with, It's all right. I know that's not something you want us knowing. He sighs, turning back to his tea, his shoulders hunched. I'm kind of jealous of you.
What?
Bucky says, forgetting to be quiet from how caught off guard he is.
Why the hell?
Not necessarily of this, Steve says, gesturing around them in his usual way. Not of this exact situation, but in general, finding out you were living in Queens. Living, Bucky, God! After 2 years of looking, I'm so grateful you were there and not frozen in some underground base somewhere. He smiles into his tea, but the rest of his face looks almost rife with sadness. You were just living. You had an apartment. You had a job. You got to do things, meet people, experience things as an actual person. You got to take the subway. Probably took you not even 4 blocks away from where I would have been staying.
Would have been?
Steve's smile fades, the barest amount. Before D.C., he says, swallowing. I was staying in a room at Avengers Tower, but then afterwards, I went looking for you.
You went looking for me?
Bucky repeats, slowly like he's trying to process the words.
For 2 years?
Hydra was everywhere, Steve says with no small amount of contempt. They had a hold on everything. I didn't have a chance to catch my breath because I thought they had you, and if I lost the trail, it meant I'd lose you too. I didn't stop except when the team needed my help in Sokovia. I didn't have time in the last 2 years to find what you did.
So you're jealous of me because...
Bucky says, then pauses, the realization dawning on him.
I had a home.
The smile returns to Steve's face, and Bucky watches, still not understanding what it means. Honestly, I'd say I'm more jealous of Peter. Bucky blinks, letting Steve see the confusion that graces his features.
Honestly, you shouldn't be. You never would have fit on my tiny ass sofa.
Steve laughs, grinning at him, and for a moment everything feels okay. His son is sleeping safe and sound on the hall. The world beyond this room is quiet and peaceful, and he's here with Steve, hot beverage in hand, a warm light above them, making the smile on his face glow.
Peter,
Bucky says as he knocks on the door for the third time, not really as irritated as he sounds.
The hell are you doing in there, retiling the place? How long does it take to throw on some pants?
I'm trying to... There's a crash from the other side of the door, Peter shouting, and the sound of something hitting the floor. Bucky opens the door, peeking in to grant the kid some modesty, only to see him sprawled on his back on the floor with his legs dangling over a tipped-over chair. His jeans are pulled up to his hips where they hang loosely, a belt clutched in his hands.
You okay?
Mr. Stark is a liar! Peter whines, pushing himself up, grabbing the waistband of his jeans with both hands to keep them from falling down. These clothes do not fit! And this belt doesn't even go tight enough to keep my pants up!
Let me see.
Bucky takes the belt from him, inspecting it, confirming that Peter's right. It needs to tighten at least a couple more inches before he can actually use it.
This is an easy fix. Come on,
he says, walking out of the room. Peter following slowly behind him, still holding his pants up. They go to the kitchen, where Bucky finds a sharp, thin knife and begins puncturing a new hole in the belt after measuring it around Peter's hips. He's almost done by the time Tony walks in, stopping in his tracks, his face pale.
What are you doing? Are you crazy?
He snaps, barreling forward, looking about ready to snatch it from Bucky's hands.
That's a $1,200 belt you're mutilating!
Bucky looks away from him to stare at the belt and the freshly made hole he's carved into it.
You spent $1,200 on a strip of leather, and I'm the crazy one.
Peter laughs, and even Bucky has to admit that the scandalized look on Tony's face is pretty funny. The man opens his mouth to respond, a biting remark on the tip of his tongue, when Friday's voice cuts in above them. Boss, incoming message from Prince T'Challa. ETA is 10 minutes. The words die on the tip of Tony's tongue, and he clears his throat, gathering himself before replying.
Right. Call Steve up here, Fry.
Bucky turns back to Peter, handing him back his belt, struck by how deflated the kid suddenly looks. His furrowed brows, his smile, now a tight frown. Thanks, Dad, he says as he tightens the belt around his hips, his downturned gaze breaking Bucky's heart.
So much for there being time for breakfast.
Tony's eyes rummaging through the fruit bowl on the counter and pulling out an apple. You guys should have some of this, he says, pretending he's talking to both of them, but proving he's not by grabbing a banana and tossing it over the counter in Peter's direction, who catches it without even looking. Once Tony is satisfied with Peter having something in his belly and Steve joins them upstairs, the four of them move to the mansion's entryway to await T'Challa's arrival. Peter hears the plane approaching long before the rest of them do, and then they watch with no small amount of amazement as a sleek black aircraft descends straight down on the cobblestone driveway in front of the building. T'Challa emerges only a few moments later, briefly unrecognizable as he steps out of the plane without his Black Panther suit, still looking every bit the royalty he is. Steve politely opens the door when he steps onto the front porch. Your Highness, he greets, the two of them shaking hands as T'Challa enters. He and Tony exchange a small nod, the man unable to help himself from commenting,
That's a pretty sweet ride you've got there.
My sister designed it.
Oh, does she take requests? I'd like one in red.
T'Challa smiles, but it drops from his face when he glances at Bucky and Peter, standing slightly off to the side, waiting. Bucky knows his own face is impassive, but Peter is a billboard of his emotions, looking completely nervous and caught between hiding behind Bucky and wanting to hide Bucky behind him.
Perhaps before that, we should discuss the matter at hand,
T'Challa offers. I agree, Steve says, and he leads the way to the large open-planned sitting room at the end of the hall. They sit, all except Tony, who stands behind Steve, fidgeting on the balls of his feet. Bucky can't help but notice the way Peter distinctly sits between him and T'Challa. A moment of silence passes, T'Challa watching Bucky and Peter with a keen look in his eyes before he says,
I have investigated your whereabouts on the day of the bombing.
Peter goes rigid beside him. Bucky doesn't bother trying to hide the look on his face as he leans forward slightly.
And?
Based on the evidence I have seen, he says, holding Bucky's gaze, I do not think you were in Vienna.
Peter lets out the breath he's been holding, collapsing under the weight of his own nerves, his body slumping against Bucky's. A helplessly relieved smile stretches across his face like the sun breaking through a sky of dark clouds. Bucky smiles back at him, but then looks back at T'Challa, unable to help himself.
Can I ask what changed your mind?
There was more than enough video footage of you in Queens on that day, T'Challa replies. Images and videos that were much more credible than the single photo of you at the bombing.
He pauses, then a strangely fond look gracing his features.
But the thing that truly changed my mind was your alibis.
Bucky blinks, his brows furrowing. Frigate Sharon.
Yes.
What did they say?
To his surprise, T'Challa outright grins!
As a warrior and prince, I am no stranger to being threatened,
he says, his head held high, even though the amusement is audible in his voice.
But I have never been treated with the level of hostility your alibis showed me when I questioned your innocence.
Bucky can't help it. He laughs, shaking his head at the idea of Frank blowing up at a literal prince for daring to insinuate Bucky was involved. Something about it feels wrong almost, that the man could trust Bucky so much, not knowing what kind of horrible things he's truly done. He wishes he could have told him everything. His heart tightens when he realizes how badly he'll miss him.
Yeah,
He says, swallowing the sudden lump in his throat.
Frank is, not exactly the warmest guy.
He is very fond of you,
T'Challa replies, glancing at Peter.
both of you.
So what happens now?
Steve asks, drawing T'Challa's attention back.
What do you plan to do?
I intend to find out who is responsible for the bombing, and why they attempted to frame Barnes for it, T'Challa says. I have come here to seek your help with that, Captain.
Steve perks up. Want help?
You have every file related to the Winter Soldier, correct?
T'Challa asks.
The best way to find out who is behind this is to establish a motive and a list of suspects. I have every intention of continuing to head this investigation myself.
He pauses, his back straightening.
But soon I will need to return to Wakanda for my coronation. So I have come to ask you for the files you have pertaining to Hydra and the Winter Soldier, so that my intelligence team can begin building a case.
We could help, Tony says, sounding maybe a little offended that he has to offer.
The more hands the better, right?
If it becomes necessary, I will let you know.
T'Challa says, not only kindly.
But I have faith my team will be able to get to the bottom of this.
All my files are in New York,
says Steve, grimacing slightly.
After everything that happened with S.H.I.E.L.D., I've been pretty stubborn about keeping all my information hidden. I'd need to come with you to provide you access to it.
I would appreciate it, Captain.
Does this mean... Peter pipes up, snapping everyone's attention to him.
Does this mean we can go home?
Bucky's sure the look on his face matches the same tight, tense one on Steve's and Tony's and T'Challa's.
The whole world is still searching for your dad, Pete,
Tony says.
Until the investigation is over, it's not safe for you guys to be out in public just yet. Tony's right,
Bucky says to Peter, taking his shoulder in his hand comfortingly.
We get the cops called on us in a heartbeat, kiddo. I have to lay low until we figure out who the hell's behind this.
He swallows, his hand tightening on the small round of Peter's shoulder.
But you...
Peter shakes his head instantly.
No!
He says, turning and fixing Bucky with a stern look.
If you're staying here, then I'm staying here.
Bucky smiles, hoping it hides the guilt he feels that Peter can't see through it. He lifts his hand and ruffles the boy's hair gently.
Okay.
If it's all right with you, Captain, T'Challa says, standing up, I would prefer to move sooner rather than later.
Of course,
Steve says, shooting Bucky a quick look, seemingly apologetic.
The sooner we get those files, the better,
he says, standing.
If you don't mind giving me a lift, we can go right now.
Ooh, send me pics of what that plane looks like from the inside, Tony says. I'll stay here and play babysitter while you're gone. Bucky grabs one of the tiny decorative pillows off the couch and chucks it at his head. The three of them see T'Challa and Steve to the door, bidding them safe travels and good luck. Steve puts his hand on Bucky's shoulder as he says goodbye, and for a moment he thinks the man is about to hug him.
I'll see you soon,
Steve says, awkwardly clearing his throat.
Don't let Tony burn the place down while I'm gone.
Oh my god, Tony gripes. It was one tiny fire in the lab, and that was years ago. Get off my back already. Peter laughs, looking truly unafraid for the first time since they got that phone call last night, and Steve smiles at him and ruffles his hair affectionately.
You're going to have your hands full with these two, Peter.
Yeah,
Too bad that spider didn't give me extra limbs.
Steve's grin widens, and he follows T'Challa out of the house, giving Bucky one last look over his shoulder before the door shuts. It's a full 24 hours before Steve returns, and it's the longest and most irritating 24 hours of Bucky's entire life.
Immediately after he and T'Challa leave, Tony once again ushers Peter into the kitchen to try and overfeed him as much as he can. Bucky keeps his comments to himself as he helps make cooks breakfast, watching Tony pile Peter's plate so full he has trouble lifting it and carrying it over to him. He holds his tongue because if Peter is hungry enough to eat all that, the last thing he'd want to do is make him feel guilty or insecure about doing so. And if he isn't, and he does it anyway just to placate Mr. Stark, well, he hopes the indigestion he'll get as a result will be less than enough. As they sit and eat, the conversation is quickly monopolized by technobabble Bucky scarcely understands. All he can do is watch in awe as Tony and Peter fire off ideas so beyond his scope of understanding that it doesn't even sound like English anymore. He merely observes their excited back and forth until he's utterly lost, and then he lets his gaze drift to the window beside the table overlooking the lake. There's a duck on the shore, waddling around the edge of the water, followed closely behind by 6 yellow ducklings. Bucky watches the way they trail behind their mother single-mindedly, following so close behind her that when she stops, they all bump into each other like dominoes. Peter's like that, Bucky realizes. It becomes apparent as the day progresses. After breakfast, Peter seems reluctant to let the conversation he and Tony were having end, and he follows him down to the basement lab, trailing after him just like one of those ducklings, as the only time Bucky sees him for the rest of the day. On Tony's heels whenever he emerges from the sanctum of the basement, the two of them still chatting so animatedly, Bucky can't get a word in. He doesn't actually get to talk to Peter until the boy comes back around lunchtime, grinning at Bucky as soon as he sees him. "Hey!" "Hey," Bucky greets in the middle of dicing vegetables. "What's up, Stark? Kick you out?" "Yeah," Peter says, reaching over and swiping a cube of carrot, evading Bucky's hand, shooing him away. "He says it's lunchtime and told me I wasn't allowed back in the lab until I ate something." Bucky really isn't able to hold it anymore. What is his deal with food? The guy's obsessed. I have half a mind to tell him to mind his own business. I tried to tell him that I was totally fine to skip lunch, but he said I wasn't allowed to keep working until I had some. His hand pauses around the knife he's holding, midway through cutting a head of broccoli in half. Allowed to keep working on what? Oh, Peter stalls, pointedly not meeting Bucky's eyes. We're just tinkering. With what? Stuff? Sighing, Bucky decides to let it go, finding it incredibly off-putting that Peter would actually not want to tell him about what he's been up to. It's the oddest, most unfamiliar feeling, having Peter actively keep something from him. It's the very first time, and Bucky can't help but feel like it's Tony's fault. Maybe Peter's being literal, and they aren't actually working on anything, just genuinely messing around with whatever spare parts Tony has stashed around the lab. Peter deserves the benefit of the doubt, but something doesn't feel right about it. The kid is a bad liar. He always has been. He's never been able to keep a secret from Bucky before, and he isn't any better at it now. But Bucky doesn't push it. He lets the kid have his secrets. It's part of the way he loves him. He knows he has a tendency to be overprotective, but he respects Peter enough to let him have his privacy as long the kid's being safe. Is the most space he could give him over the last year while they shared their entire lives in one room. He's never had to press Peter to tell him anything, but he also never would have. He trusts Peter. Tony, less so. But Bucky keeps a careful eye on them throughout the day, waiting for any sign of anything being amiss. He hardly sees them outside the basement, but when he does, the atmosphere around them is comfortable, if a little excitable. Tony can't seem to keep his own enthusiasm curbed once Peter's put a new idea into his head, and the two of them feed off each other's excitement until they rush back into the basement to bring whatever idea they're talking about to life. Bucky listens raptly to every word they say, but he still doesn't have the foggiest idea about what's actually happening behind that door. And even later on in the day, once Tony's disappeared and he and Peter are cleaning up from dinner, doing the dishes together side by side, Peter's enthusiastic rambling somehow manages to say nothing at all, despite how much he's talking. So we were talking about a way to make the sequence actually non-consecutive, because if we want to make the program run by bypassing the automatic command prompts, then it won't need to go over every single prompt consecutively, and it won't lag or give us that stupid error message anymore. Peter says in one long go without taking a breath. Which would be awesome because I'm trying to get it to run smoothly, but every time it goes through the prompts consecutively, the sequence gets confused and it doesn't do what I want it to do. Well, Bucky tries, not even knowing where to begin. That's rough, buddy. Peter laughs, accidentally splashing soap suds everywhere as his shoulders shake with laughter. He seems okay, Bucky realizes, watching his body language and his expression, listening keenly to the tone of his voice. It leaps and bounds above how he was last night, when he was nervous and reserved and scared. He seems more like himself here, smiling, talking excitedly, so enthusiastic about what he's saying that he forgets to breathe. Bucky tries to take control of how he's feeling, but it's odd watching Peter shower that kind of wide-eyed attention on someone else. It's familiar the way he's acting, but it's unfamiliar because it's to someone else. It's not the same as watching him interact with Ned, a peer, who is very similar to him in a lot of ways. It's not even the same as watching him interact with Frank or his wife, or Delmar, people Peter respects and even admires, but doesn't lavish with the same kind of attention he gives Bucky. And Tony, apparently. He spends the rest of the night watching the two of them exist in their own little world, watching Peter get to spend time with a man he's idolized for years, a man who saved his life once, just like Bucky had. Peter's known Tony Stark for most of his life, has been his fan and admirer long before he even knew Bucky existed, so really he has no claim to being looked at like that. It's not something that belongs to him. So why does he feel cheated? It's an emotion he keeps to himself until Steve comes back the next morning, taking one look at him and somehow just knowing that something is wrong. Bucky has no intention of telling him, but then he watches Peter excitedly follow Tony back down into the basement, that same anxious bubbliness in his step. Steve can plainly see the displeasure on his face. The man places a friendly hand on his shoulder, giving him a small smile as he offers, "It's okay to be frustrated." Bucky frowns. "What do you mean?" "Buck, come on," Steve says, and the smile on his face kinda makes Bucky want to hit him. "You're watching your kid transfer his hero worship from you to another person, and you're scrambling to hang on to that worship a little longer." "I'm not scrambling," Bucky protests, but it sounds weak even to him, and he sighs deflated. "You're right, it's just..." He looks up, gazing at the stairs longingly. "I always knew Peter would outgrow me someday," he says. "I just wasn't expecting it to be this soon." The smile on Steve's face softens to something less teasing, more affectionate, and he squeezes Bucky's shoulder and starts leading him away from the stairs. "Hey, come here. I want to show you something." Bucky glances at him confused, but lets Steve guide him back to his own room, where he sees the boxes Steve brought back with him from New York stacked neatly off to one side. Bucky had just assumed they were files or Steve's belongings that he wanted to hang on to while the investigation proceeds. But to his surprise, the man takes one of the smaller boxes, brings it over to him, and opens the flap. "Steve?" Bucky questions, gazing into the box and freezing when he sees the coffee mug on top. He recognizes it right away. "World's Best Dad," printed across it in looping cursive. That's his mug, the one Peter gave him, but he doesn't understand why Steve has it. "What?" "I thought you might want this stuff," Steve admits kind of shyly. "So I pulled some strings, said the Avengers needed it for our investigation." He turns and gestures to the right of the boxes. Bucky feels his heart skip a beat. "I managed to save it from being locked up somewhere." He takes the box, not knowing what the hell to say. It's odd having his and Peter's entire life together packed in boxes like this, something sort of sad about it, but he's surprised by how genuinely relieved he is to see it all, not realizing until this very moment how much it all meant to him. He starts swallowing around the edge of his voice. "Steve, this is... wow." "I wasn't trying to snoop," Steve says in a somewhat defensive tone. "But, if you have some time, I'd love an explanation for these." He grins as he pulls out one of the cheap, colorful stuffed animals Peter won on his birthday at Coney Island. Bucky laughs, taking the stuffy from him and setting the box down, opening it fully. "Well, if you're sure," he says, smiling, gesturing to the edge of Steve's bed. "Have a seat."